So welcome and good evening. For those that don't know me, my name is Regan Miner, and I'm the chairman of the Historic District Commission. So welcome all to the October 21st, 2021 special meeting of the Historic District Commission. The purpose of this meeting is to hold an informational session on updating the Historic District Commission's design guidelines. So for everyone's information, this meeting will be recorded, and I'll just ask that if you're not speaking to please mute your microphone so we don't pick up any background noise. The goal is to have this meeting be about an hour in length. Our consultant will give about a 20 to 25 minute presentation, and then we'll take questions from the floor at the end of the presentation. So please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. I wanted to just give some quick little background as to how we got here today. So this past year, the Historic District Commission was awarded a Certified Local Government, or CLG, grant from the Historic Preservation Office to hire a consultant to help update the design guidelines. Our consultant is working with members of the Historic District Commission to create a concise and clear document that will be used by the Commission to assist in its decisions and will be useful to anyone who is considering work which alters the architectural features of a historic structure located in a local historic district. I wanted to just clarify where the two local historic districts are, and I know Chris is going to talk more about that in a moment, but the two local historic districts in question that we'll be discussing this evening are the Norwich Town Historic District and the Little Plain Historic District. So I'd like to introduce our consultant, Chris, who's going to then lead us into a presentation. So Chris Skelly has over 20 years of experience with local historic district ordinances, local historic district commissions, district property owners, public meetings, public hearings, local historic administration, and design guidelines. He served as a national local historic district commission trainer with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions and created and led regional historic district commission workshops in Massachusetts and nationwide on the Secretary of the Interior standards and local historic district design guidelines. Further, he created and led regional historic district commission workshops on alternative materials in local historic districts. Chris has reviewed and edited local historic district design guidelines contracted through CLG grants. His publication experience includes state historic preservation plans, as well as guidebooks for local historical commissions and local historic district commissions, such as preservation planning manuals, guidebooks for historic district commissions, and establishing local historic districts. Chris currently lives in Western Massachusetts, and we're so fortunate to have him as our consultant, and I'm so pleased to introduce everyone to Chris Skelly. So Chris, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Regan. It's great to be here, and just want to welcome everyone to the meeting tonight. Looking forward to talking about this project, where we're at. So as Regan stated, I'm a preservation consultant developing a set of design guidelines for these local historic districts in Norwich. And I'd never been to Norwich before this fall. So I just want to say I've been so impressed by the amazing collection of historic resources that you have in your city. Norwich really is a remarkable place, and I've just been very taken by everything I've seen in terms of your wonderful downtown, all the residential neighborhoods and the mill villages and the mill buildings, the landscapes, just everything. And of course, your local historic districts as well. So you live in a wonderful place. Okay, so before we get into the design guidelines, I think it's good just to take a step back, because this comes up a lot in my 20 years of experience doing local preservation work. This is always something that is a big part of the confusion. So I thought we would just explain this little distinction here, that there are two kinds of historic districts around the country, and there are two kinds of historic districts in Norwich. So there are National Register districts, and then there are local historic districts. So these are the National Register districts that you have in Norwich. So Greenville and Yentic Falls, the downtown, Taffville, Panoma, Laurel Hill, Jail Hill, Chelsea Parade, Bean Hill. these are all National Register districts. So they are not local historic districts. These were designated by the National Park Service and were placed on the National Register of Historic Places. So the National Park Service reviewed all of these districts as part of a nomination process, and those came from the state of Connecticut, and they found that these districts met the criteria for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So those criteria, essentially those criteria mean that they found that these areas are either historically or architecturally significant or both, and were worthy of listing on this nation's list, this National Register of Historic Places. So you've probably heard of the National Register of Historic Places before. It does have lots of districts on it. It also has individual properties on it. It is national, obviously. Every state has listings on the National Register. So Norwich has National Register districts, but you also have some individual properties on the National Register as well. So the main thing about the National Register is that it's an honorary designation. So when it's done by the National Park Service, National Register districts are honorary districts. So essentially, this is not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about local historic districts, the other kind of historic district that are out there. So local historic districts are these two right here: Norwich Town Local Historic District, Little Plain Local Historic Districts. These kinds of historic districts were established by your city council through a city ordinance back in the 1960s. Now, they also happen to be National Register districts, but the key distinction here is that they really are just our local historic districts. That's the key distinction for us tonight. Okay, so these two districts were established through local city ordinance in the 1960s in order to protect these areas from loss and destruction. So whereas the National Register districts are really just honorary, the local historic districts really have the ability to really prevent demolitions and all kinds of alterations to historic resources. So the idea of protecting historic buildings through a city ordinance started in Connecticut in the 1960s, and that's true for plenty of other states. But this idea of actually protecting historic resources through a city ordinance goes back a lot further in our country. It goes back to the 1930s. So in the 1930s, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, established local historic districts through city ordinance. So they were the first two places in the country to actually use this kind of a tool to protect historic resources. And so another key thing about local historic districts I just want to point out is that basically when things get reviewed in a local historic district, it's exterior features that are visible from the public way. That's what the review is taking place. So the way that local historic district can help protect historic resources is that under that local historic district city ordinance, certain projects in the Norwich Town and Little Plain historic districts are reviewed by the Norwich Historic District Commission. So what can happen to an area to a significant area of historic resources when you don't have a local historic district and historic district commission trying to protect those areas? Well, here's what happens when you don't have local historic districts. Buildings like this one disappear or demolished within just a few hours. When you don't have local historic districts, you can go from a building that looks like this to one that is so severely altered that is no longer recognizable. When you don't have local historic districts, you can have demolitions that take place, and then in their place, you can have new construction that that basically is not compatible with the setting of the historic buildings in that area. And all this can happen with no community input. So that's why pretty much local historic districts have been established throughout Connecticut, throughout New England, and throughout the country. So you go to any state, you're going to find local historic districts. Texas has quite a few local historic districts. I was in Texas doing a presentation in East Texas a couple years ago regarding how best to protect their local historic districts through a city ordinance there. So I've had several visits to the local historic districts in Norwich now, and I'd have to say that the local historic districts here have done just this amazing job of protecting this irreplaceable collection of historic buildings. It makes me wonder what might have happened to this area had those districts not been protected. These districts not been protected in the 1960s. Had the city not established that local historic district ordinance in the 1960s, what would have happened to Norwich Town and Little Plain, which are just incredibly, remarkably intact neighborhoods. Just an amazing collection of intact historic resources in both of these districts. And so National Register districts, on the other hand, even though you might see some very intact National Register districts as well, it's an honorary district. National Register districts are an honorary district. And that means that basically nothing is protected into the future. So even though a National Register district may look very intact today, tomorrow, I just showed you some images of what could happen tomorrow in a National Register district. So local historic districts provide a means of protecting irreplaceable places while still being vibrant places to live and work, adapting to a modern world. They aren't meant to be a museum. The idea here really is that around the country, local historic districts are places that people live, work, run businesses. It's not a museum place. The goal of a local historic district is to guide changes, providing a means of protecting providing a means to protect those irreplaceable places that we have, but still being vibrant places that people can live, work, all adapting to our modern world. All right, so now we're just going to get into the guidelines part here. So design guidelines are there to try to assist everyone in understanding what works in a local historic district and what does not work in a local historic district. So it's really meant to have a document, a reference that provides a clear avenue for balanced changes that are thoughtful and sensitive to the historic setting of the district. And they cover all kinds of projects that might take place in a local historic district. So the design guidelines, the hundreds of design guidelines that you would find if you looked at them across the country, they all follow a similar format. Large and small local historic districts, big and small cities. The idea is kind of the same with local historic district design guidelines. And the idea is to cover within the design guidelines the various projects that might come up under the review of the district commission and the city ordinance. So for instance, things like new construction, masonry repair, rehabilitating a porch, putting on an addition, all these kinds of things are going to be included within the design guidelines and are there to help explain how those projects would work best within the local historic districts, how those projects can be most compatible with the existing historic setting of the district. So who uses design guidelines? Well, yeah, as Regan said, yes, the district commission is certainly going to review these guidelines. So when a project were to come up, the district commission would look at the design guidelines and get a sense of how that proposed project would fit within their design guidelines. But everyone else uses design guidelines as well. Anyone that has any kind of relation to the local historic district areas. So property owners in the local historic district would certainly going to use design guidelines. Contractors, architects, developers, they're all going to use design guidelines because guidelines take out the guesswork. Once adopted by the district commission, anyone looking to make an exterior architectural change in the local historic district that is reviewable under that city ordinance could pick up this document, this set of design guidelines, and quickly understand what kinds of projects are likely to be approved. It's kind of really, it's really a way for you as property owners or architects, contractors, to make it a lot easier, make it a lot clearer. As Regan said, a concise way of understanding how the whole process works. So as I mentioned, there's design guidelines that are all over the country and in all kinds of different places. So Santa Fe is going to have a set of design guidelines. Beacon Hill in Boston is going to have a set of design guidelines. As you can imagine, those design guidelines are going to be very, very differently written based on the kinds of historic resources that are in the district. So Santa Fe in particular is going to have a very different set of design guidelines than we would have up here in New England. I'm just going to show an example of what one page of design guidelines might look like. So let's imagine we were looking at a set of design guidelines and we flipped to the page on porches. Here's some language that might be in design guidelines related to porches. Preserve existing historic porches and their individual architectural features. Repair deteriorated architectural features on the porch. If replacement is necessary, choose similar materials and design. Maintain the historic openness of a porch. So you can see there's all this, the language in there that kind of gives a sense of the kinds of changes that would be compatible in a local historic district area. Local historic district design guidelines are also really big on having lots of images and illustrations and things like that because photos, captions, and things like that can really help clarify things better than words in a lot of ways. So I think if you looked at these two photos here, you can see the top photo, how that would really meet the design guidelines. Any work on that porch, it's going to meet what's here. The openness of the openness of that porch, any work that was done in that porch, kept the architectural features, the trim work, the turned columns, all those things are still part of that porch there. Whereas the image on the bottom, you can see where it wouldn't meet the design guidelines. The porch has been enclosed. They've used vinyl siding to cover the porch. It's lost a lot of its architectural features that way, and a change to a porch, as in the bottom photo, would typically not meet design guidelines in any design guidelines that I've ever read. So the idea is to have a set of design guidelines that anyone can flip to the page, flip to the applicable page of the design guidelines, open them up, and feel confident in understanding moving forward with your project based on what you're reading in the design guidelines. All right, so next steps in this project are right here. So we're on the one right now, seek community input on the design guidelines. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing in a few minutes here. We'll be looking for your input on what you would like to see in the design guidelines. And then after that, we'll be putting together a draft version of the design guidelines. And we'll be looking for some community input after that as well. So there'll be the chance to have some community input on the document itself. And then we'll finalize the guidelines based on input from the community and come up with a final set of design guidelines. And then that will be adopted by the Historic District Commission and will be used from then on for each of their review decisions. So every monthly meeting, they'll be looking at the design guidelines to get a sense of how best to approve that project. I like to think of design guidelines as never actually being finished. So I like to think of design guidelines as always something that can be changed in the future. They are just guidelines. So there's certainly ways to think about whatever we come up with for design guidelines during this project. Well, there can always be more input. There can always be more discussion. There's always things that need to get put into design guidelines later on. So obviously you can think of something like satellite dishes. Well, nobody had satellite dishes in their design guidelines decades ago, but that's something that we would need to have in design guidelines today. So design guidelines are certainly a changeable thing, and certainly as you're reviewing design guidelines in the future and you come up with other things that you think should be in the design guidelines, definitely bring those up with the Historic District Commission for discussion. Okay, so those are our next steps, and well, I'll just say so timeline here a little bit. I think the hope is that we would have a final set of design guidelines somewhere around the beginning of the year. Looks like a little flexible there, but somewhere around the beginning of the year have a set of design guidelines. So that means somewhere later this fall we'll have a draft document available. Okay, so that was my presentation, and I'm going to turn it back to Regan for how we have some discussion about the local historic district design guidelines.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. That presentation was wonderful. Thank you. And I'll just add to his timeline a little bit. So we're hoping for our next public input session will be sometime in December. We don't know exactly when yet. It'll be dependent on Chris's schedule and also the schedule of the city of Norwich. So think about December sometime for our next public meeting. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions and any discussion. And if you do have a question, I would just ask if you could just please state your name before you say your question or your comment, just so we have it for our record. So just state your name and then you may ask your question or say your comment. So anyone is welcome to speak at this time.
Hello, it's Jonathan Webster.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you for doing this, everyone. I really appreciate this work. Enjoyed seeing photographs of my house. One thing I would like clarity on is the guidelines pertain to the exterior, architectural features. But there's always been some questions about my house because some people have said it's what you can see from the public right of way or from the public roads. And it's not clear if the cemetery behind me is a public right of way. In the winter, you can kind of see my house through the trees, but in the summer you can't. So I would just like some clarity on that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. And I know other people have had that question as well. I don't know if Chris, you have an answer. I can do my best to answer that too. Or Chris, I don't know if you've had any experience with questions like this in the past. Just for clarity, the Colonial Burying Ground is right behind Jonathan's house. So that's the public space that he's referring to. And he's right, during the winter, you can see his house a little bit, but then in the summer, the tree growth has come in and it's hard to see the house. So that's been a question that's been brought up in the past. So Chris, I didn't know if you had any thoughts as to that.
I can give some general sense of experience. That your question has come up in many other local historic districts that I've been involved with. So most of my experience is in Massachusetts. So yes, it's come up plenty of times. What is a public way? It's one of those times where I very happily hand it off to the city attorney to say, I don't know if it's a public way or not. Here's a legal question, and so I guess you have to you get to take it. It comes up in other challenging ways as well. So it doesn't. I've seen it come up where it's not even something like a cemetery. It's an alleyway, and so this has happened in a number of places. Is that alleyway a public way, or is it a private way just for the abutters? And it's not a simple answer, even on something like that. It really does actually take some deed research to get a sense of is that considered a public way or not. So I'm afraid I can't answer specifically on the cemetery. Probably it would be best if it went to City of Norwich legal department.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'm happy to follow up with our city attorney on that question. He would have the more specifics that I'm hoping will answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, if it just got written into the guidelines, then the question would be answered, forever. That'd be nice.
Sounds good. I have a note down to chat with the city attorney about that question. So thank you. I'll contact the city attorney.
Thank you.
You got it. Any other further questions? Any comments, discussion? And again, just state your name before you ask your question or say your statement, please.
I'm happy to say, go ahead. Go ahead.
Greg Farlow. None of this would be retroactive, right? In other words, if somebody's got a disc on the front of their house facing the green, they wouldn't have to remove it and put it in the back, would they? Or would they the guidelines would apply to that? That's all.
Oh, thank you, Greg. My understanding, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is not retroactive. This is just everything moving forward. But Chris, correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, no, I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's more of the ordinance itself, more than the guidelines. So it doesn't. I mean, you're asking a great question, but it doesn't necessarily relate to the design guidelines. It relates to whether is everything is the way everything is right now. Can that remain that way? Is there any way under that city ordinance that the Historic District Commission can make you change something back to the way it was before? And the answer is absolutely not. I mean, so essentially, just like zoning, everything's grandfathered in at the time that the ordinance is established. So zoning uses the term non-conforming uses. We don't have a term like that in local historic district ordinances. But so short answer is no, there's nothing under the ordinance that means you have to go back and make anything look more historic in any way. Yeah. A house could be covered with vinyl siding right now. If you established, let's say another local historic district was established in Norwich. So see if this works to explain it this way. Let's say another local historic district was established in the city of Norwich, and there were 5 houses in that new local historic district that were covered with vinyl siding. There is nothing that the Historic District Commission could do to make those owners remove the vinyl siding off the house. That vinyl siding can stay there forever.
We could keep the 6th owner from putting vinyl siding on it, though.
Yes. So once the ordinance is established, then it would be up to the District Commission on whether they would approve covering a house with vinyl siding. Yeah. So yes, the design guidelines would be something in the design guidelines that would say covering a house with vinyl siding would not meet the design guidelines.
Good question, Greg. Thank you. And Bill, I think you were next I think you wanted to speak next, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and I don't want to throw too many monkey wrenches into this discussion. I'm on the board of the Norwich Historical Society, and I want to make it very clear to everybody, probably everybody who's listening knows this. The Norwich Historical Society is different than the Norwich Historic District Commission. They're two totally separate things. That's number one. Number two, the Norwich Historical Society had a forum several years ago talking about the Connecticut Historic Homeowners Tax Credit Program. And I know your commission struggles all the time with windows. You know, many people want to replace the windows. They think they're more energy efficient, etc. I bring up the Historic Homeowners Tax Credit Program because that could be a help for people who are who have to keep their old windows. And very briefly, it's a program where if you do work according to the Secretary of Interior's guidelines and you're in a national register or a local historic district, and you're spending a certain amount of money, I think it's either $15,000 or $25,000, you are eligible for getting a check sent back to you for roughly 30% of the work you've done. So if you, for instance, are spending $50,000 on a new kitchen and restoring windows, you can get a check sent back to you from a corporation working through the state historic preservation office for $17,000. It's a fantastic program. I'm taking advantage of it myself currently, and perhaps, Regan, we should have another forum about that.
Yeah,
In the
no, Bill,
future.
it's a great idea. Yeah, I try to promote the tax credit program when I can, because it is a fantastic program and it can help offset some of those rehabilitation costs for homeowners. So definitely more information about that in the future would be great. Thank you. And we do plan on, when we have a draft of the guidelines completed, one of our sections includes resources for homeowners. And I was hoping we could include information about the tax credit program under those resources as well. So that would be available for everyone to look at. Great, thank you. Any other questions? And just, again, remember to state your name before you speak. Any questions, anybody? You're all welcome to speak at this time if you'd like. Are there any members of the commission itself who have questions for Chris at this time?
Greg does, Greg Farlow.
Go ahead, Greg. Thanks.
Pursuing windows, old windows. In your experience in various districts that you've, assisted with or consulted, what are the general thoughts about it? Because we've got some houses with some really old glass that's fallen out. And we'd like to do storm windows on the outside to protect, the window and the glass. Even though back in 1675, they didn't have storm windows, but, we're going to lose the glass if we don't do something. But what has been your experience with that kind of thing, putting on storms on these older houses?
Yeah, I find that it's pretty common for local historic district design guidelines to find some way to accommodate storm windows generally. Yeah. So yeah, I think I feel like, again, as well, feel like they really do provide lots of energy efficiency to have a good set of storm windows on there. Yeah, I mean, I would like to talk more about storm windows. We'll definitely have storm windows included in the design guidelines, and
all right, good.
That'll be part of our discussion, is how do we find some ways to accommodate things like storm windows.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because it's the glass we're concerned about. We have internal storms. So it's the external glass that, you know, is starting to fall out. And so we want to protect it from the weather until we get the money to, you know, get them reglazed.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
That makes sense. Thanks, Greg.
I'm done. Get the storms up now. Okay, I'm out.
Thank you.
Tim Dowen. So one of the things that we've seen in recent COAs is emergency need to address a situation, and then it comes to the COA after. I don't know if we want to address that somehow in the guidelines. I'm not sure. A caveat, whatever they do in an emergency situation may not be appropriate and have to be addressed somehow.
Mhm.
That's a good question, Tim. And I know one of the conversations that I need to have with the city attorney is addressing that as well, in addition to the other question that I'll bring before him. I personally have had a lot of conversations with the State Historic Preservation Office about some of those emergency repairs. And, you know, as long as the owner is in communication with us, and if I, well, as me as the chairman, if I'm communicating with the owner and if the material that they're planning on using is appropriate, would be in line with what the commission would approve, then, you know, I give them the verbal okay to move forward with the emergency repair. And then, you know, I'd still recommend them come to the commission with a COA afterwards, just as a formality. But Chris, I don't know if you've had any other experiences with that in other districts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll definitely include some language in there on emergency projects. I hadn't thought about how that process works when it's not going to meet the design guidelines. If it's, I think so you're kind of wondering how projects would go through the process. If it's an emergency project, we go through the process if it wouldn't actually meet the design guidelines. Is that how this comes up?
Or just wording to say, work with us, so we can ensure that it will be in line, I think, with what would be appropriate.
Mhm.
You know, we're certainly aware that something has to be addressed in a quick situation, but we don't want to have to be the bearer of bad news if it doesn't fit. Certainly working with us, with the HDC, excuse me, would be the plan or the guidelines in that situation, I would hope.
And part of this isn't necessarily design guidelines. Part of this is how your ordinance is worded. That's why I think the legal counsel needs to review that as well. So it's how your actual local law reads. And then does your local law allow you to do what we would call either rules of procedure or something that gets more specific? Sometimes they're called rules and regulations, sometimes called rules of procedure. That's another document outside of design guidelines. I mean, design guidelines are really there to try to help everyone understand the kinds of projects that would likely not be approved in a local historic district, and the kinds of projects that would likely be approved in a local historic district. Rules of procedure can be there to help guide everyone on those kinds of issues, on how do we handle our process when other things come up.
Understood.
That might be one way to pursue it. Yeah.
I think I was overstretching on that part for design guidelines. So yeah. Okay. Thank you.
No, it's good. It's good to bring it up here. And I do think we should have a little bit, I mean, our design guidelines that we're putting together, we will have a lot of introductory material as well. So it's not necessarily jumping right into the guidelines themselves. I mean, we're going to have some information in the guidelines about the history of Norwich, the history of the local historic districts, and then also get into some of the process of how this all works, like what like a flow chart of how the application process works, things like that. We're going to talk about the difference between local historic districts and national register districts in the beginning of the design guidelines. We're going to talk about architectural styles that are found in the local historic districts. So it will cover a number of other things besides just the guidelines themselves. So yeah, we can touch on the emergency process. We just can't. I don't think you can use your design guidelines to direct how that process is going to work, because that's not really what guidelines do.
Thank you. That makes sense. And I'll just add to Chris's statements of, we're really hoping that this document will be an educational tool and a resource for homeowners, for the commission, for the city of Norwich, for anybody doing any sort of work in the local historic districts. We're hoping this will be a great resource for everybody. And I do want to just mention that our goal is to have the document on our website, which is a web page on the city of Norwich's website. And then there also will be printed copies in the building department at the city of Norwich as well. So we want this document to be as accessible when it's completed as possible for everyone to review. So any other questions for Chris or myself? If anyone does have questions that they think of after this meeting, you are welcome to email the Historic District Commission. Our email is hdc@cityofnorwich.org. Again, that's hdc@cityofnorwich.org. So if you have any questions following this meeting, I would be happy to respond to your email. And again, we will have another public session probably in December as well. So I just want to ask one more time, are there any questions for Chris? Anyone have any other comments or questions?
On mute, yes. Greg Farlow.
Okay, go ahead, Greg.
Excellent, excellent, well presented, clear. Just wanted to mention that. It's a
Oh, thank
clear
you.
presentation. Very well done. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
That was your cue to close the meeting.
I was just going to ask one more time. I was going to give everybody one more moment to ask questions. And then any questions, any further questions or comments from anybody from the floor? All right. Again, feel free to email us, hdc@cityofnorwich.org, and keep a lookout for our December info session as well. With that being said, I think we'll close the public hearing, which is at 6:20, and we'll have our regular meeting, which is the only thing I will say is that our next meeting is November 17th, 2021 at 5:30 via Zoom. And I would ask for a motion to adjourn now.
I move that we adjourn. Tim Down.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Is there a second?
Second, Richard.
And Richard, second. Thank you all so much. Is there a vote to adjourn? I'm going to look for my, hang on. Looking for everybody on my screen here.
I'm here.
So I'm looking for my commission members. So I'm just going to do the roll call for my commission members. So I'll have you, Greg Johnson, start us off, please.
Aye.
Nancy.
Aye.
Richard.
Aye.
Tim.
Aye.
And Greg Farlow.
Aye.
And I will also vote aye. So we are all officially adjourned. Thank you all so much for attending this evening, and stay tuned for more information.
Good meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Chris will be in
Thank
touch, I'm sure.
Great, thanks, Reagan.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
Chris.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Mhm.